Hi there, welcome back. We're going to conclude our study of David in this video. We will start with 2 Samuel chapter 9 and go all the way through 1 Kings chapter 2. You'll notice that what's called the succession narrative doesn't include 2 Samuel chapters 21 through 24. Those are often understood to be an appendix of the book of Samuel. By the way, I'm saying the book of Samuel, not the books, simply because Samuel was a book, just like Kings was a book. They really only became two books once they were put into the Greek tradition and translated into Greek. So all to say, Samuel is just one book, and Kings is really just one book, and we can see that they actually have this continuous narrative throughout. But what's amazing is that this bit from 2 Samuel chapter 9 through to 1 Kings chapter 2, if you take out 2 Samuel chapters 21 through 24, you get this amazingly tight narrative, and there's a lot of foreshadowing in it and a lot of repetition. So it's very clearly a unified piece. What's really fascinating about it is that just like the material that comes before it about David, it is quite remarkably honest about David's shortcomings. The shortcomings that we saw at the beginning of the David story that were a bit hidden, or that people often overlook, they are very clear to see in the second half of David's story. It's hard to exaggerate, it's hard to overstate just how shocking this is, that the official story of David is so critical of him. Scribes in the ancient world, people who wrote things, worked for powerful people. Writing was a very complicated technology in the ancient world. I know that many people are taught to write today, but in the ancient world, writing was reserved as a technical skill that was reserved for people who were trained to write, and people who could write for a living were employed by either a temple or by a king, or every once in a while by some sort of commercial entity, something like what today we might call a business or something, or a firm. But that was pretty rare. Almost all scribes worked for some sort of local bureaucracy or national bureaucracy, or worked for a temple. And just think about this. The royal court, like the information that's given in 2 Samuel chapter 9 through 20 and 1 Kings 1 to 2, reflects on the royal court. Somebody who's writing it has access to some of these stories that come from the royal court, and many of these stories were critical of David, even though David became the hero of this very nation, of Judah. So Judah's own story about its founding ancestor is a very critical one. Stories about kings in the ancient world that were written under their own authority, we're not critical of them. If a scribe wrote this stuff about Pharaoh, Pharaoh would kill the scribe. There's just no question about it. When we read stories about kings in the ancient world that were written by their own courts, they treat them as heroes, period. There's nothing critical about them in those stories. When you read stories about kings written by other kings who assassinated them or justifying their own usurpation of the crown or something, then you might get some negative stories. But that's not what happens with David. He founds a legacy that and a dynasty that continues for hundreds of years, and he's written about critically. So there's something going on here. We'll explore that as we go on. But just to say, royal biographies are propagandistic in the ancient world. None have been found that look like this David story, in which, we can say that there are versions of the David story in the Bible that are much less critical, like the book of Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is just one book, the book of Chronicles, divided into kind of two parts because it got too big to carry when it was put into scroll form. That's basically why. It's hard to carry these things. Scroll is made out of leather. Parchment is leather. So carrying around a giant piece of leather became a bit unwieldy with a book as long as Chronicles or Samuel or Kings. So they divided it into two for carrying purposes, really. And because the scrolls were too big to unravel and read. But all to say, the book of Chronicles has a very positive view of David. In fact, it edits out all of the negative information that we find in this succession narrative and presents a completely sanitized version of the David story. It's quite remarkable because Chronicles looks like what other ancient Near Eastern royal biographies look like. But the book of Kings and the book of Samuel are quite honest, in fact, compared to that. What we see, really, is that this David that is idealized in Jewish and in Christian tradition and in history, when you actually read closely, we get this astonishingly different narrative, a narrative that preserves the story of David's failures. As we see, I've got this image of Pharaoh up here. I showed you the image of Pharaoh at the beginning of the videos in which we began talking about royal theology and the story of the rise of David. Because David clearly turns into Pharaoh over the course of this story. And then David's kingdom is in some ways deconstructed underneath him. David presents a problem. So all to say, this is what we're going to delve into today. If we look back at this narrative about the rise of David, we see that David has this discussion with Nathan in chapter 7, where God gives the covenant to David through this vision of the prophet Nathan, the oracle of the prophet Nathan, where God is going to build a house, right? So we have this, the temple's not going to be built by David, it'll be built by David's son Solomon. But then in chapter 8, David attacks the Philistines and subdues them and brings a triumph and really I say peace. We'll see that there isn't true peace in Jerusalem, but at least an end to war with the Philistines in Jerusalem, which is, remember, those pressures that were being put on Israel, those external pressures were the Philistines and other nearby nations that were trying to conquer the tribes of Israel. So David does this, right? And then in verse 13 of chapter 8 of 2 Samuel, the text says, David won a name for himself, which is what God promised in chapter 7. But then it says in verse 14, he kills all these Edomites, and then it says he put garrisons in Edom, and the Edomites became David's servants. And the Lord gave David victory where he went. We're going to see that David begins to subdue and subjugate other people, foreign people. David, at the very end of his career, if you turn with me to that appendix, there's some interesting stuff in here. But one of the interesting things at the very end of chapter 20 of 2 Samuel, so 2 Samuel 20, verse 23, it says, "Now Joab was in command of all the army of Israel." This is just telling us who was in David's cabinet, basically, his leadership. Verse 24, Adoram was put in charge of the forced labor. That is the people's forced labor, what's called corvée labor. The very thing that Israel was upset about with Pharaoh, David implements among his own people near the end of his life. So this issue of forced labor is going to come back, and in fact is going to be the reason that the northern and southern kingdoms split. Why the other tribes, the northern tribes, split and declare independence from Judah is precisely because of the forced labor issue. We're going to see that again in Solomon's career and in the career of his son Rehoboam in 1 Kings 11 and 12. So keep your eyes out for the mentions of forced labor all throughout the book of Kings. So in any event, David brings peace, or at least peace of a certain kind, an end to conflict from foreigners that are trying to conquer Jerusalem. And David, in chapter 8, verse 15 of 2 Samuel, David reigned over all Israel. David administered justice and equity to his people, at least in part, at least in kind, and so on. So from 2 Samuel chapter 9 on, we do get this narrative where David begins to have recurring problems, family problems. Other problems as well, but there's recurring problems within his own family and recurring problems with the family of Saul. Saul's family, including Mephibosheth, who we see in 2 Samuel chapter 9, but also people who were part of the Benjaminite tribe and people who were related to Saul. So Sheba and Shimei are two characters who show up a couple of times. Both of them are problems for David and for David's family, and they arise within the Saulides, or the Benjaminites, the people from Saul's family and Saul's community, Saul's tribe. You can probably imagine why the Benjaminites and why Saul's family felt particularly angered over David and why they revolted at certain times. precisely because David seems to have stolen the kingship from them, right? But there's also a secession attempt at internal conflict and war that is produced by the Benjaminites. So we'll see that in just a little bit. But just to say, you can see these conflicts roiling this entire time. So in chapter 11, we get this story that is famous, but oftentimes people, especially in Christian communities, tend to read this story a bit quickly, and they tend to gloss over a few important details that change the way that we think of this story. I've got on the screen here a typically European and American understanding of the Bathsheba story, that she is bathing on the roof, that she is somehow an exhibitionist. She's showing her body off. She's trying to get the attention of David in this image. You can see that Bathsheba is, kind of bathing in public on her roof, and she's kind of pointing towards the towers of the palace that are right above here. We're gonna ask a question about this. Also, from here on out throughout the video, just so you know, we're going to talk about several different instances of sexual violence, and just to let you know that is coming up. That this is a recurring theme in David's life. So, starting with 2 Samuel chapter 11. In the spring of the year, the time when the kings go out to battle, David, the king, sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. This is already a critique, that David was supposed to be, out at battle, when kings go out to battle, but David instead sends other people to fight his battles for him, and he remains in Jerusalem. And then the next sentence kind of hammers home the critique. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house. So let me say something here. This late one afternoon, David rose from his couch. The word for couch and bed are the same in Hebrew, because people would sleep on their bed and then also kind of sit on it. Think about like a futon almost, right? So this is his bed. He rose from his bed late one afternoon. He had been sleeping in, right? So David is sending people to do his dirty work for him, and he is lounging at home, probably because he can, right? He's got enough power, he's got enough money, he's got enough fame. He's just going to enjoy himself. He's going to try to exercise his kingly power for his short-term pleasure. This is what I meant when I said that there are some problems with the Davidic covenant, that if you start to think that God loves you no matter what, then you might start to say to yourself, maybe I can do exactly whatever I want. And you can start to treat other people like trash. You can start to disregard their own worth and dignity. And it seems that that's what David does here. So David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, and he saw from the roof a woman bathing. That woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. An important thing to say here: in many English translations up to the late 20th century, it was said that the translation would say that David saw a woman on her roof. But in fact, the Hebrew is incredibly clear. David was on his roof, spying on a woman who was bathing. Where is she? She's bathing. That's all that we know from here. She's not on her roof. The text never says anything about her being on her roof, being an exhibitionist. In fact, the text says that David's the one on his roof looking into or out of, onto somebody else's house while they are bathing. She was probably bathing where other people bathe, that is, not on their roof in public. She was probably in private. That is, this is how it's often depicted in Christian tradition. This is a medieval illuminated manuscript. This is actually from the Psalms here, but this is David, and you can see him staring out at Bathsheba, who is like in his yard or something, taking a bath naked, kind of playing with the water, trying to get his attention or something, looking coyly over her shoulder. This is not what the text is describing. The text is describing a situation a bit more like this. This is a peeping, what's sometimes called, in kind of almost funny words, funny terms to make it seem less bad, I think, a peeping Tom situation. But this is somebody who is looking intentionally into someone's private space and is invading their privacy in this intimate moment. So, in any event, David then sends someone to inquire about the woman. He doesn't just look at her. He's beginning to get involved. And then it was reported, so the way he hears back, that's Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So David sent messengers to get her. In Hebrew, this is the word lakah. This is a word that is meant to seize, to grab. It can mean to take when it's used about women, and it's men who are the subject and women are the object of this verb. It is often sexual in meaning, and it often has to do with rape. This is when a man takes a woman like this. It is very different from a consensual situation where a man and a woman know each other, which is another biblical word used to talk about sex. This is very different. This is a violent situation. So David sent messengers to seize her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. This is not a consensual situation here. He is the king. He has all authority. He has the authority to demand anyone's life at any moment. And he took her, and he told her that he wanted to lay with her. This is sexual abuse. This is rape. This is if you've ever been in a situation like this, if you know someone who's in it, if you witness a situation like this, you are witnessing sexual abuse. We can't stand by and say this is Bathsheba's fault. That's inappropriate for us, not just because that seems to actually get wrong in the text, but also because these texts have important after effects in our own communities. This text has been used to validate and to explain away the abuse of women by powerful men for some time as something like a little foible or something like that, or she was trying to get me, is what some powerful men have said. Instead, this seems a bit more like a situation that was in the news quite a bit, the Harvey Weinstein situation, where Harvey Weinstein used his money, his power, his authority, and men that he hired to seize women, to take them, to abuse them. So all to say that this is, the text is letting us know that this is a violent, horrific act that David is doing. And it's in part, he sees something and he wants it, and he feels like he can have it. He feels entitled to other people's bodies and their lives, as we'll see with Uriah as well. So it says now she was purifying herself after her period. So he's violating purity laws as well in chapter 11, verse 4. But it also, this is important later, when she is with child. Then she returned to her house, the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I'm pregnant. As in, what am I supposed to do now? I'm married, and my husband is away at war, which you sent him to, and he knows that he hasn't been here in some time. So if I tell him I'm pregnant, right? I mean, there's all sorts of things that, she is now endangered. David has endangered her in many ways, but also now she is in danger of her own husband, who might react very negatively to this and might be violent. So David then sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And you imagine that maybe David's going to do the right thing here, or at least, if you're reading this for the first time, you might say, well, maybe David's going to own up to it, right? And Joab sent Uriah to David. And when Uriah came to him, remember, this is one of David's great generals. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. And David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. Now, feet in Hebrew, sometimes, most of the time, just means feet. But he wouldn't send him to his own home to wash his feet. David's got plenty of baths in his giant palace, right? He's telling him this is a euphemism. This is a language that people use that really means something else. So in Hebrew, feet can mean genitals. So wash your feet. Right, you can see what that means. He's trying to tell him, he came home from battle, might as well go home and love your wife and then go back to battle. Right, get a little R&R at home is kind of what David is trying to say here. So Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house and didn't even go down to his own home. So Uriah wasn't going to go home. Why? Because his men that he was in charge of weren't able to come home to their families. So he wasn't going to go home to his family. He's trying to make it so that he withstands all of the different trials that his own troops had gone through. See, this is kind of showing us a bit about leadership that David is not showing at all. Caring about his subordinates and trying to not make sure that he's not the one, like that his subordinates don't suffer more than him just because he has power and money. Uriah, right? So in any event, when they told David Uriah didn't go down to his house, and then David says, "Oh darn it! I wanted that to in a way cover for my sin, right?" But then verse 11, Uriah said to David, "Hey, the ark in Israel and Judah remain in booths, that is tents. Yeah, everyone's in a tent, right? Joab's in a tent, all my men are in a tent. I'm not going to sleep in a nice house tonight." So then David gets him drunk, but even that doesn't work, right? I mean, David can't get this guy to go home because he has such, upstanding morals, right? And then the next day, David comes up with a new plan. He's going to get rid of Uriah, and that will solve his problem. So he sends this note, right? Put Uriah in the forefront. Put Uriah in the front of the battle. And in fact, that happens. And Uriah dies in battle. So now Bathsheba's husband has been murdered. David engineers the murder of Bathsheba's husband to cover over his rape of Bathsheba. Oftentimes this is spoken of in Christian circles as something like, he had an affair. David had an affair. We can't talk about it in language like that because that teaches people that this is what an affair is like, when in fact this is a very different situation. So then, verse 26 of chapter 11, when the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. When her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. At least David is offering her a place to live. We'll see that some of David's family does not even do that after committing sexual assault. But all in all, this is David's family is learning from what David is doing here because they repeat these sins, and David seems to not really do anything in response. We'll see this later with Amnon and Tamar. Now, look at the very end of chapter 11, very beginning of chapter 12. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. That is, God noticed and watched. Not in time to save Uriah, it seems. Not in time to save Bathsheba, it seems. But nonetheless, God saw, and then God acts. And so God sends the prophet Nathan. I think it's really, really important here. By the way, here's a little image of just Uriah and David trying to get Uriah drunk, but then also telling Uriah to go home and so on. But this is a really important turning point in this narrative because prophets in the ancient world were in every single culture that we know of in the ancient Near East. One thing that they did over and over was tell the king how wonderful the king was, and they told the king messages from the gods that were intended to uphold the king's authority and power. Prophets were people who heard messages from God. That they were spoken of as messengers. When they say, like, thus says the Lord, the prophets of the Old Testament, other prophets would say, thus says Marduk, thus says Chemosh, thus says Osiris, right? All the great gods of the ancient world had prophets, and those prophets would deliver their messages like a messenger. So when they said, thus says Marduk, the god of Babylon, thus says Marduk, then they would give the message because they were a messenger. They were a divine messenger. Well, they were humans, right? But they were delivering divine messages. That's what a prophet was. Well, prophets existed to help the kings and tell the kings sometimes some slightly negative messages, but always in the king's interest and in the king's favor. They would never tell a king, you're a sinner or something like that, except in Israel. This is the one place that in the ancient Near East that we see prophets that are bold and boldly stand up to kings and tell them that they're wrong, who operate on a completely different principle, who aren't beholden to the kings, don't seem to work for them. Also don't seem to work for the temple. These prophets in ancient Israel, they told the temple that the temple was wrong, and they told the king that the king was wrong. Who were they working for? It's unbelievable. In the ancient Near East, we see prophets everywhere, but we don't see prophets like this. So all to say that why was it that in ancient Israel they had prophets that worked against the state and against the king and would prophesy the death of the king and the death of the state even. The book of Amos says Israel's going to die and the king is going to die. This was taken as treason, and it was understood as treason in Amos chapter 7. The idea being that the temple is the chapel of the king. The king exists in a personal relationship with the gods. The king is the son of the God, right? David is the son of Yahweh. Solomon is the son of Yahweh. So if you say some stuff about how the king is bad, that's treason. You're talking ill of the state and you're talking ill of God, right? It's apostasy and treason. But in Israel, they didn't treat it this way. Unbelievably, you might make the kings incredibly mad. The kings might want to try to kill some of the prophets sometimes. But there was a tradition in ancient Israel, unlike other cultures, that prophets were supposed to tell kings their sins. They were supposed to tell kings what the kings had done wrong, and that the kings were supposed to listen to this and, in fact, repent, change their ways. I cannot overstate how crazy this is in the ancient world, but also that we don't see Moses receiving, Moses was the leader of Israel, right? And he doesn't receive messages from humans that are critical of him that he says I'm sorry about, right? I mean, if you think about it, people were critical of Moses in the wilderness all the time, and Moses never said to them, you're right. Think of the Korah rebellion in Numbers chapter 16, for example, where Moses just says, no, you're all wrong. All of you are wrong, right? This tradition of people listening to prophets and saying, I'm sorry, starts here in 2 Samuel chapter 12 with David. David begins a tradition of ancient Israelite kings receiving the words of a prophet and accepting the criticisms and saying, I'm sorry, and then trying to do something, however little, to try to fix it. This is a watershed moment in the history of Israel, and indeed, the history of the world, that people could be critical of a king and that the king was supposed to say, I'm sorry. We'll see that this is a tradition, and not a tradition, but this is a theme that's repeated in this succession narrative about David, that David hears several times messages from people that are critical of him, and instead of saying that person deserves to die, he says they have a right to criticize me, and in fact, they're right. People have wondered, with all of David's problems, with all of his faults, his horrific faults, why it is that David has such an outsized role in the Bible. I'd argue it's this. This is, David's a good, important military leader and hero, and David can sing some songs and so on. A lot of people can do those things. David is an evil ruler in many ways, like many rulers throughout history have all been. In fact, I think there's no leader that does things without thinking of themselves and trying to take themselves in. There's different degrees of this, of course. Not every leader is exactly the same. But I do think that there's a human temptation in leadership to do what's right for you. David does this too. And yet, David also listens and repents, which for someone in the highest office in the land, it's a quite unusual situation. So, Nathan comes with this message that's been given by Yahweh, but he's not going to tell it directly, right? He tells this parable, a story, right? Once upon a time, and it really does kind of start with this once upon a time language. Once upon a time, there were two men in a certain city, one rich and the other poor, and he tells this story, right? And in the end, David hears the story and says, yeah, of course, the rich guy who took the last lamb from that poor guy, he's awful, right? In verse 5, then David says, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. And then Nathan says, you are the man in the story, the rich man who stole the sheep from the poor man. And David has already judged himself. This man deserves to die, but I'll be lenient and let him pay back fourfold what he's done. And then Nathan says, that's you. That's you that you just judged. And then, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, in verse 7, I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul, and I gave you your master's house. I gave you everything. Verse 9, why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in God's sight? Here we have a full-fledged condemnation of what David has done. You have struck down Uriah the Hittite. You have taken, there's that word again. This is naming the sexual violence for what it is. You have taken his wife to be your wife. And you have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house. So that is, there will be violence within and without, ramifications of this. That is to say, God's not sending violence on David. David has done this to himself. He's planted the seeds for the violence in his own house. We'll see in chapter 13, his son Amnon does a very similar thing that he did to Bathsheba, to his half-sister Tamar. That is to say, Amnon learned from his father. And what Nathan is saying is that this sin is going to continue. The ramifications, the earthquake that's going to go out from this, you'll never outlive it. It will shake you for the rest of your life. So then God is going to raise up trouble against you from within your own house. And then also there's going to be external problems as well. And then verse 12, for you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before Israel, before the sun. God's judgment is going to be public on David. Remember, this is David's inner circle that is writing this story. How is it possible that David allowed this story to be written, to even be known outside of his palace? Unless there was a desire by David and by David's family afterwards to admit some of his problems, to admit at least the ones that we know, to let this full airing out that God talks about here, this sunshine, right, as a disinfectant in some way, to allow that to David's story, to allow David's story to actually air in the way, with all of its terrible details. So, all to say, we've got to move on, but you can see in chapter 13 that there is this horrific situation that develops within David's own family. His son Tamar and his son Amnon and Amnon's half-sister Tamar are the characters, the central characters in the next chapter, in chapter 13. It starts with David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister. His name was Tamar, and David's son Amnon fell in love with her. Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister, and so on. And then this crafty man, wise man, begins to think about, kind of hatch a plot. If you notice in the story, Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar, and he grabs her, like verse 11. But when he took her, when she brought them near to him to eat, he took hold of her, and he said to her, "Come, lie with me, my sister." And she said, "No, do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do anything so vile. As for me, where can I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the scoundrels in Israel." I mean, she's clearly explaining to him all of the reasons that this is a horrific thing to do, even for himself. She's trying to give him a sense, I mean, even for you. You want to do this thing now, but even it's going to destroy you too. Now therefore, she says, "I beg you, speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." So in other words, if you want to marry, I mean, family marriages were a very different thing in the ancient world. And in fact, all throughout the ancient world, marriage conventions within families were much different than they are today. People could marry close cousins quite regularly, and in fact, within royal families, often there was a very close intermarriage. Famously, in Egypt, many pharaohs were married their sisters, their biological sisters. So that is to say that this was even in modern Europe, there was quite a lot of close family relationships. Let's say that. But she's asking that they go about this the right way, if this is in fact what he wants to do. Then Amnon, it says in verse 15, was seized with a great loathing for her. He's very angry that she's trying to tell him what to do, that she's trying to explain to him. Indeed, his loathing for her was even greater than the lust he had felt for her. Amnon said to her, "Get out." But she said to him, "No, my brother, for it is wrong, and this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. King David finds out about this, that Amnon has destroyed Tamar's life. When King David heard of all these things, verse 21, he became very angry, but he would not punish his son Amnon, because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom, Tamar's brother, hated Amnon because he had raped his sister Tamar. So we see that David refuses to get involved. David does not try to help Tamar in any way, and he does not address Amnon's violence. And then Absalom, the full brother of Tamar and the half brother of Amnon, gets revenge for his sister. 2 years later, in fact, sets up a situation where there's a feast and where Amnon is murdered. So now we have murder and rape within the family of David. A lot like the Bathsheba incident, and a lot like what David did to Uriah. So Absalom then runs away, and the king, David, is worried for Absalom as well, but is also not going to really get involved with trying to help Absalom understand right and wrong, and he'll pay for that as well. So Absalom comes back to Jerusalem. The king, David, forgives Absalom in chapter 14, and then in chapter 15, Absalom tries to steal the throne. Absalom rebels against David. He begins by building himself up and boasting about, well, if only I were king in the land, then I could fix everything. This is in chapter 15, verse 4. I would give you justice if only I could. And then he goes to Hebron, where David had been crowned king, and he gets himself crowned king. There's a rebellion, right? Again, you might say, well, this is treason against David. Well, this is exactly what David did, right? David did this against Saul and Saul's family. Absalom seems to have learned a thing or two from his dad. David then has to run away during this rebellion. And this is an amazing moment. David, this powerful, kind of amazing guy, at least in the eyes of everyone else. I mean, the Bible says he was great in people's eyes, right? This rich, apparently attractive and handsome, powerful man who was in charge of everything and had all these kind of, military medals on his jacket, right? I mean, he was an all-star, a rock star singer. This guy has to run in shame from his son and abandon Jerusalem and just go out into the wilderness and try to survive for a little while so his son doesn't execute him. In chapters 15 and 16. But notice also that David, when he's running away, he runs into some people that he used to know. So David runs into Mephibosheth, Saul's son, the only surviving member of Saul's family. But then also he runs into this guy Shimei. And take a look at Shimei here. Take a look at Shimei here in chapter 16, verse 5. When King David came to Bahurim, a man of the family of the house of Saul, remember Saul's family? Yeah, this is a guy from the house of Saul who came out. His name was Shimei, son of Gera. He came out cursing, and he threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David. Now the people and all the warriors were on his right and on his left, and Shimei shouted out, "Out, out, murderer, scoundrel! The Lord has avenged on all you with the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. Ha 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 ha! See disaster overtaking you, for you are a man of blood." You can see this two ways. One way is if you're a friend of David and a supporter of David, here's a guy who's cursing, your general, right? David might be on the run because he's worried about Absalom taking over the kingdom. But he's not alone. His general, Joab, and all of his soldiers are there with him, right? Who is this guy Shimei who's going to yell and throw stones at David and curse him and say that he's a man of blood, which God says too, right? But also kind of laughing at David's misfortune. There's an army right there next to him. You'd imagine that he'd get killed right away. So then verse 9, Abishai, son of Zeruiah, one of the soldiers, said to the king, King David, "Why should this dead dog curse my king? Let me go over and take off his head." I mean, this is what they would do back then. If you cursed the king, you would die. But then the king said, David stops his own soldier from going over to this guy who's cursing David for organizing the death of this guy's entire family, right? Saul's family's mostly dead. David says about this guy cursing him, calling him a loser and a man of blood. David says, the king says, verse 10, "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah?" In other words, when people ask that in the Bible, they can mean a couple different things, but it often means like, what do you think is going on here? David says, if he is cursing because Yahweh has said to him, "Curse David," then who shall say, "Why have you done so?" David's not even going to respond to him, not because David hates Shimei or because David even thinks he's wrong. David thinks he's right. David agrees that he deserves all of the cursing that anyone can dish out. This is a king saying this, a king on the run, but a king nonetheless. David actually exercises bizarre levels of humility, astonishing levels of humility right here for who he is. Again, that doesn't explain away any of David's deep and horrific faults. But it is to say that David is an incredibly complex character who does set a precedent of kings being criticized and not trying to kill those who have criticized them, of kings accepting in some way the truth behind other people's complaints about them. This is a different kind of relationship to power than we see throughout the ancient world. In verse 11, David then said to Abishai, another soldier, and all of his servants, "My own son seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjaminite," one of Saul's kin, right? "Let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has bidden him. He's doing God's good work to criticize me. Let him do it. And my kid is right too," is in a way what he's saying. I deserve it. I mean, that's shocking stuff. It may be, verse 12, that the Lord will look on my distress and the Lord will repay me with good for the cursing of me today. He says maybe it's a good thing. Maybe I'll learn something from it. Maybe God will see in some way that, I understand. I understand that I should be humiliated, is what he's saying. Maybe God will look kindly upon me, not killing this guy, but instead taking his words to heart. It's David's fierce courage for Yahweh that leads him to adopt this stance of humility. So then Absalom ends up taking over Jerusalem, but then there's a battle, as we see, and in that battle, Joab and his soldiers end up defeating Absalom and Absalom's soldiers, and Absalom dies, right? His sort of beautiful hair gets caught up in a tree. Here, this is a Marc Chagall print where you can see David receiving this news, and then you can see Absalom in the background in the green, his hair kind of caught up in the tree. So anyway, in any event, David gets to go back into Jerusalem, and when he gets back to Jerusalem, Shimei shows up again, this guy who cursed him, right? Shimei thought that David was on his way down, which meant that it was okay to say all those things that he thought he should say. That happens sometimes when people in power have a lot of enemies, or they do a lot of things that are shocking and terrible. Some people who are in positions of power wait until that person is on their way out the door before they start to let the secrets loose, right? Shimei thought that was the moment, but then David regains power, which Shimei seems to thought wasn't going to happen. So in chapter 19, verse 16, Shimei was there, and he hurried to meet the king so that he could apologize. He wanted to save his own life. And then in verse 18, you can see that chapter that is headed, at least in the NRSV, with David's mercy to Shimei. Shimei, son of Gera, fell down before the king, and he said, "Hey, don't hold me guilty for what I said, right? I'm sorry, I've sinned. I was wrong with what I said about you being, terrible and a man of blood and so on." And then Abishai, the same guy as before, right, who said, "Let's kill him." Abishai, son of Zeruiah, answered, "Shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed?" Right? That's what happens. You curse the king, you die, right? Now we're going to kill him. And in verse 22, David said, "What am I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah?" He says that same thing again, right? Like, you don't understand what's happening here. "What am I going to do with you, that you today should have become an adversary to me? If you want to kill this guy, you're going to become my enemy, this guy who criticized me," right? David's now in a position where he could kill this guy no problem, and everyone would understand. But David says, "Shall anyone be put to death in Israel today? For do I not know that this day that I am king over Israel?" And then the king said to Shimei, "You're not going to die." And he gave him his oath. We're going to hear this name Shimei come back up again early in the Solomon story, so keep your ears out for that. But just for now, David has actually been publicly gracious to someone who tried to kill him. Sheba, son of Bichri, in 2 Samuel 20, begins a rebellion, and he says, "We have no portion in David, no share in the son of Jesse. Everyone to your tents, O Israel." That means everyone get ready for battle. This is hearkening back to the language of the tribes. So that is to say that the tribal coalition that used to kind of gather for war, when everyone to your tents, so Israel, grab your tents so that you can camp out together and get your weapons and then go to battle, right? And pitch your tent in the army together. But so when he says we have no portion in David, no share in the son of Jesse, what he means is the Judahites are getting all of our stuff. the Judahites are getting our tax money, right? Like, we're not getting anything out of this relationship with David. This is all about David and all about his own family and his own people. So let's organize ourselves and let's free ourselves of this menace to the south who's just leeching onto us and taking all of our stuff. That's basically what he's saying. So he gets the people of Israel, the northern tribes, Ephraim being the biggest and the strongest, to withdraw, and like they declared independence. And then there was a civil war that follows after that. There's this very interesting story of the wise woman of Abel Beth Maacah, who figured out that David was going to win this and wisely figured out how to get on the right side of this. She is, as many women characters are in the Bible, unfortunately anonymous. That is, she's not named in the story. But all told, this kind of remarkable story of her leadership within the city during the time of a siege in which lives were at stake is a remarkable one. At the very end of this, chapter 20, this is the end of the succession narrative in the book of Samuel. It picks up again in 1 Kings 1 and 2, and I'll talk about that in just one moment. Just to say, in chapter 21, we have this story of basically David killing all of the Saulites that are left, all of Saul's family that is left. It's like kind of in retribution for the Gibeonites who were attacked by Saul. So all to say, this is like explaining why David was so brutal towards Saul's family. Of course, we can probably think of other reasons why he's brutal to Saul's family, but then it ends with these really interesting poems. Chapters 22 and 23. Chapter 22 is basically David's take on Hannah's song in 1 Samuel 2, which also sounds a lot like the Magnificat, the story in the song of Mary in Luke chapter 1, verses 46 and on. And it's about the reversal of power. It's a really, really interesting poem for David, the king, to be singing. But it's beautiful as well in its own way. But then in chapter 23, we have David's take on the Davidic covenant. So 2 Samuel 7 is a statement of the Davidic covenant. 2 Samuel 23 is another statement of the Davidic covenant. You can read them and compare them. I'd say Psalm 89 is a third statement of the Davidic covenant that we see in the Bible. They're all a little bit different from each other, but they agree on the main foundations. But the most interesting part of this little appendix that we can see here at the end of 2 Samuel is 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 15 through 22, these kind of stories of David's men. But especially verse 19, which says, "There was another battle with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, son of Yare-Orgim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam." That's a quotation from 1 Samuel 17. That is to say, buried at the end of Samuel is a note that says, actually the guy who killed Goliath was not David, but was one of David's friends from Bethlehem, who worked with David, fought with David. There's another really interesting moment in verse 16 as well. Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze, big giant dude, was fitted out with new weapons, said he would kill David. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and attacked the Philistine and killed him. So as David was threatened by this big giant guy, and David's friend came and saved him. We don't hear about David killing giants, actually, in this story. So all to say, you can have a lot of different explanations for who this is. There's two Goliaths or something. I doubt it. Two big Goliath giants that David fought, and you wouldn't say somewhere that this is one and not the other, right? So what seems to have happened is that David's story grew over time, and that he became more and more of a hero. But what's amazing is that what didn't shrink, at least in the story of Samuel that we have, what didn't shrink was David's failures. They did shrink in Chronicles. The author of Chronicles edits out all of David's failures, but they remain here in the Bible. The fact that they survive, I cannot stress. I know I've said it a bunch of times, but I can't stress how remarkable this is. Now this, I'm kind of stepping on Professor Yoder's territory with the book of Kings. I'll let her introduce Kings and describe it. But just to say, chapters 1 and 2 of Kings are the very end of David's life. It's also the beginning of Solomon's story, really. So we'll leave that for the next class. But just think for a moment, the very end of David's story. He is cold, lying on his bed, can't get warm. He's this kind of shell of a person. David has fallen, and he's fallen hard. it is incredible that this is the end of David's story, and then this gets out. There's a struggle for succession. Is David a failure at the end of his life is actually an important question. He's not able to have a clear ruling on which son he wants to be his heir. There's a war as a result. David dies in the midst of this crisis and this turmoil. So, David, according to the Deuteronomistic historian, right, who's organized this material, David is not the gold standard for Israelite kings because he's perfect, but because he loves Yahweh, and because he, at times at least, is able to admit to his own failures. Remember Deuteronomy 17, which tells us the law of the king. The king is supposed to read the Torah over and over again, not acquire horses, not acquire stuff. David seems to break these precepts, but also he does seem to continue to meditate on God's presence with him. Keep that in mind, though, as we read 1 Kings 1 through 11, and we read about Solomon. It's important for us also to end by noting the importance of Davidic theology, royal theology, Zion theology for the New Testament, for Jesus, and for Christians. A lot of our theology comes from this theology of the monarchy, the royal theology, the establishment of Jerusalem, the messianic hope, right? A king was a Messiah, someone who had been set aside by God to bring deliverance to the people, and so on. It's important to say that kings changed over time in Israel, and their understanding of what a king was changed over time. Instead of a Messiah being every single king, so anyone who was anointed for God's special purpose, instead it became a hope for someone who was going to bring order and right to the world, someone who's going to bring justice and peace, true peace, someone who's going to bring equality to the world and instill it as it should have been all along. This is part of the idea behind Jesus, right? That Jesus is a Messiah. But it's important to note that this word and this concept changes over time. When we see here an image of Jesus entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday on the back of a little donkey, people waving poor palm branches at him and throwing their tattered cloaks on the ground as if it's a massive procession of a king. Jesus does upend some of these ideas of royal theology at the same time participating in them. But this idea that kingship is a contested idea in both in ancient Israel and in the New Testament. When we say kingdom of God, what do we mean? What kind of power, what kind of authority do we mean? These are thoughts that we will continue to wrestle with over the course of this semester, but more especially in the second semester when we talk about the prophets. So keep these kind of these tensions in mind, and remember that prophets are the ones who testify to the covenant of Moses, right? It's important to say that the king is never outside of the covenant of Moses, that the Mosaic covenant, the king is a part of that because the king is a part of all the people, and the prophets are the ones that hold them responsible to it. So Jesus, as both a king and a prophet, and in some way a priest too, as he is figured in the New Testament, these are all aspects of theology that we'll come back to again and again this semester and next. We'll move on in our next session to the life of Solomon, and we'll see you then.